It was a bright and sunny Saturday morning in Meadow Hills. This was a small, quiet neighborhood where houses sat close together, lawns were green, and people usually kept to themselves. Kids played outside sometimes, riding bikes or kicking balls, and grown-ups waved at each other from their porches. It was a peaceful place, well, almost peaceful. There was one person who made sure things weren't too calm. That person was Karen Miller. But before we talk about her, let's meet Jake Carter. Jake was a regular guy. He wasn't loud or fancy. He didn't have a big, shiny car or a huge house. Nope, Jake was just a normal dude who moved into Meadow Hills about a month ago. He lived in a little house at the end of the street, with a small front yard and a driveway just big enough for his old, beat-up truck. That truck wasn't pretty. It had scratches on the sides, a dent in the back, and a rusty spot near the wheel. But it worked fine, and Jake liked it. He'd park it right in his driveway every day, nice and neat, and that was that. When Jake wasn't driving his truck, he was usually inside his house or sitting on his porch. He didn't bother anyone. If he saw you walking by, he'd give you a little wave and a friendly smile. "Hey there," he'd say, and then go back to whatever he was doing. He didn't throw loud parties or leave trash everywhere. He was just Jake. To most people, he seemed like a normal, quiet guy who wanted to live his life. And for a while, that's how it went. But here's the thing: not everyone thought Jake was so normal. One person, in particular, had a big problem with him. Her name was Karen Miller, and she wasn't just any neighbor. Oh no, Karen was special. She called herself the HOA Queen. HOA stands for Homeowners Association, which is like a group of people who make rules for the neighborhood. They decide things like how tall your grass can be or what color your house can be painted. Most folks didn't care too much about the HOA, but Karen? She loved it. To her, the HOA was her kingdom, and she was the boss of everything. Karen lived 3 houses down from Jake. Her house was perfect, super clean, with flowers all lined up in neat rows and a shiny mailbox that sparkled in the sun. She spent her days walking around the neighborhood, looking for trouble. If your trash can was out on the wrong day, Karen would know. If your dog barked too loud, Karen would write it down. She carried a little clipboard with her everywhere, and she'd scribble notes about anything she didn't like. To Karen, Meadow Hills had to be perfect, and she was the one who made sure it stayed that way. Now, when Jake moved in, Karen noticed him right away. She stood on her porch that first day, arms crossed, staring at him as he carried boxes into his house. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She just watched. To her, Jake didn't belong. His truck was too old and ugly. His clothes weren't fancy enough. He didn't come say hi to her or ask for her approval. In Karen's mind, Jake was an outsider, a stranger who didn't fit into her perfect little world. And that made her mad. From that very first day, Karen had her eyes on Jake. She'd peek out her window every morning, checking to see if his truck was still in the driveway. She'd walk by his house extra slow, looking for something, anything she could complain about. "That truck is too big," she'd mutter to herself. "It's ruining the neighborhood." She didn't like how Jake kept to himself, either. Most people would come say hello to their neighbors, but Jake didn't. He wasn't rude, he just didn't go out of his way to talk to anyone. And to Karen, that was a problem. But here's the big secret: Jake wasn't as simple as he looked. Sure, he seemed like just a quiet guy with an old truck, but there was more to him than that. Karen didn't know it yet, and neither did anyone else in Meadow Hills. Jake had something hidden up his sleeve, something big. It wasn't a fancy car or a pile of money. It was a secret, and it was the kind of secret that could flip everything upside down. Karen thought she was the one in charge, the one who knew everything about everybody. But she had no idea what Jake was hiding. See, Jake wasn't bothered by Karen's glares or her little complaints. When she'd march past his house, squinting at his truck like it was the worst thing she'd ever seen, he'd just sit there and watch her go. He didn't get mad. He didn't yell back. He'd just sip his coffee and wave, like nothing was wrong. That made Karen even madder. She wanted him to fight back or move his truck or do something. But Jake didn't. He stayed calm, too calm, maybe. Like he knew something she didn't. The neighbors started to notice Karen's fussing, too. "Why's she so worked up about that guy?" they'd whisper to each other. "He's not hurting anybody." But Karen didn't care what they thought. To her, Jake was a problem, and she was going to fix it. She didn't know it yet, but she was walking right into a trap she couldn't see coming. Jake's secret was waiting, quiet and sneaky, ready to pop out when she least expected it. So that's where our story starts, a sunny day, a quiet guy, and a nosy neighbor who thought she ruled the world. It seemed like a normal Saturday in Meadow Hills, but it wasn't. Something big was brewing. Karen thought she had everything under control, but Jake? He was ready to surprise her and everyone else, too. What was his secret? How was it going to change things? You'll have to stick around to find out, because this story's just getting started. Karen Miller wasn't the kind of person who kept quiet when something bugged her. Oh no, if she didn't like something or someone, she made sure everyone knew it. And Jake Carter? He was at the top of her list. From the moment he moved into Meadow Hills, Karen had him in her sights. She didn't like his old, scratched-up truck parked in his driveway. She didn't like how he kept to himself. She didn't like him. And she wasn't shy about letting him know. One day, not long after Jake settled in, Karen marched right up to the fence between their yards. She stood there, hands on her hips, staring at his truck like it was the ugliest thing she'd ever seen. "That truck's an eyesore," she yelled, her voice loud and sharp, like a teacher scolding a kid in class. "You can't park it there, it's against the rules." She pointed at the truck with a finger that shook a little, she was so mad. Jake was outside when she shouted. He was sitting on his porch, drinking a glass of water and watching the clouds go by. When he heard Karen, he looked up, blinked, and gave her a little nod. "Okay," he said, "nice and simple." Then he smiled a small, friendly smile and went back to sipping his water. He didn't yell back. He didn't argue. He didn't even get up from his chair. He just sat there, calm as could be, like Karen's big, loud words didn't bother him one bit. That drove Karen nuts. She wasn't used to people ignoring her. See, Karen loved being in charge. She loved telling people what to do and making sure they listened. In Meadow Hills, she acted like the boss of everything. She'd walk up and down the street every day, her shoes clicking on the sidewalk, holding a little clipboard in her hands. That clipboard was her favorite thing. She'd write down every tiny problem she saw: grass that was too long, trash cans left out too early, a bike parked in the wrong spot. You name it, Karen had a rule for it, and she wrote it all down. To Karen, rules were everything. She'd made herself the queen of the HOA, the group that made the neighborhood rules, and she took her job very seriously. If someone broke one of her rules, she'd knock on their door or call them up, telling them to fix it right away. Most people just rolled their eyes and did what she said, because it was easier than arguing with her. Karen liked that. She liked being the one who decided what was right and wrong. It made her feel big and important. But Jake? He was different. He didn't jump when she yelled. He didn't apologize or move his truck when she told him to. He just nodded and smiled, like he didn't care what she thought. And that made Karen madder than anything. She wanted him to fight back or say sorry or something. But Jake didn't. He stayed quiet and kept doing his own thing, parking his truck in his driveway every day like nothing was wrong. To Karen, that was like a slap in the face. Who did this guy think he was? So, Jake became her favorite target. Every chance she got, she'd find a reason to complain about him. She'd stand on her porch, glaring at his house with her arms crossed, her eyes squinting like she was trying to see through walls. Sometimes, she'd talk to her little group of followers, other neighbors who liked to gossip and follow her around. "He's ruining the neighborhood," she'd say, her voice low and grumpy. "That truck is so ugly, and he doesn't even care. He doesn't belong here." Her friends would nod and agree, because they didn't want to make Karen mad either. Day after day, Karen watched Jake. If he mowed his lawn, she'd say it wasn't short enough. If he put out his trash, she'd say it was too early. But mostly, she hated that truck. To her, it was a big, rusty sign that Jake didn't fit in her perfect little world. She'd point at it and huff, "It's against the rules," even though nobody else seemed to mind. The other neighbors didn't care about Jake's truck. Some even liked him, they'd wave back when he said hi and thought he seemed nice. But Karen didn't see it that way. To her, Jake was trouble, and she was going to make sure he knew it. The funny thing was, Jake didn't seem to mind her at all. When she yelled over the fence, he'd just look at her, nod, and go back to whatever he was doing. If she glared at him from her porch, he'd wave like they were old pals. One time, she stomped over to his yard and said, "You better move that truck, or I'm calling the HOA." Jake just shrugged and said, "It's my driveway, Karen." Then he walked inside, leaving her standing there, fuming. That calm attitude. It made Karen crazy. She wasn't used to people not listening to her. Most folks in Meadow Hills would do what she said just to keep her quiet. But Jake? He didn't budge. He didn't get mad or scared. He stayed cool and quiet, like he wasn't worried about her at all. And that made Karen wonder what was his deal? Why didn't he care? Most people would at least argue a little, but Jake didn't. He was too calm, maybe. Like he had a trick up his sleeve that she couldn't see. The neighbors started noticing, too. "Why's Karen so mad at that guy?" they'd whisper when she wasn't around. "He's not doing anything wrong." Some even thought it was funny. They'd see her yelling at Jake and shake their heads, wondering why she cared so much about a truck. But Karen didn't stop. She kept watching him, kept complaining, kept trying to make him bend to her rules. She thought she had the power, that she could scare him into doing what she wanted. What she didn't know was that Jake wasn't scared. He wasn't worried. He was just waiting. Waiting for the right moment. Because Jake had something Karen didn't expect, something she couldn't control. Her yelling and glaring didn't bother him because he knew something she didn't. And soon, she'd find out what it was. The tension was building, like a storm getting ready to break. Karen thought she was winning, but Jake? He was ready to turn the tables. Weeks passed in Meadow Hills, and things didn't calm down. If anything, they got louder, especially Karen Miller's voice. She wasn't giving up on Jake Carter and his old truck. Every day, she found something new to fuss about. Sometimes she'd yell over the fence about how ugly the truck was. Other times, she'd tell her little group of friends that Jake was breaking all her precious rules. Her complaints started small, but they grew bigger and noisier, like a snowball rolling down a hill, picking up speed. One Saturday afternoon, Karen decided she'd had enough. She couldn't stand looking at Jake's truck anymore. It sat there in his driveway, scratched and rusty, mocking her perfect neighborhood, or at least, that's how she saw it. So, she put on her shoes, grabbed her clipboard, and stormed across the street to Jake's house. Her face was red, her eyes were narrowed, and she was ready for a fight. She banged on his door with her fist, bam, 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 like she was trying to wake up the whole street. Jake heard the noise and opened the door slow and easy. He peeked out, still in his old jeans and a plain shirt, scratching his head like he wasn't sure what was going on. Karen didn't wait for him to say hi. "I'm calling the HOA board," she shouted, her voice so loud the birds in the trees flew away. "That truck's been in the same spot for too long. It's against the rules, and I'm done with it." She waved her clipboard in the air, like it was proof she was right. Jake leaned against the doorframe and looked at her. "It's my driveway, Karen," he said, nice and simple, like he was talking about the weather. His voice was soft, not mad or mean, just calm. That made Karen even angrier. She wanted him to yell back or argue something she could fight against. But Jake didn't give her that. He just stood there, watching her with those quiet eyes of his, like he wasn't worried at all. Karen wasn't having it. She wasn't going to let him brush her off that easy. "Oh, you think you're so smart, huh?" she snapped. "Well, we'll see about that." She reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone, and started dialing right there on Jake's front lawn. She didn't call the HOA board like she said she would. Nope, she went bigger. She called 911, the police. "Yes, hello," she barked into the phone, pacing back and forth on the grass. "There's an illegal parking situation here. This man's truck is breaking all the rules, and he won't move it. You need to come right now." Jake didn't move. He stayed right where he was, leaning against the doorframe, watching her make that call. A tiny smirk, a little smile crept onto his face. It wasn't a big grin or anything loud. Just a small, quiet curve of his lips, like he knew something funny that Karen didn't. He didn't say a word. He didn't laugh or tell her to stop. He just watched, hands in his pockets, like he was waiting for a show to start. Why didn't he care? Why wasn't he mad that she was calling the cops on him? That's the thing, something was up, and Karen didn't see it yet. While Karen was busy yelling into her phone, something was already happening. Down the street, where the houses curved around the corner, a police car rolled up. It didn't come fast with sirens blaring or lights flashing. No, it moved slow and quiet, like it didn't want anyone to notice it just yet. The car stopped a few houses away, out of Karen's sight. She was too busy shouting to hear the soft crunch of tires on the road. Yes, it's an emergency, she told the person on the phone. This guy's ruining everything. Jake saw the police car, though. His eyes flicked over to it for just a second, then back to Karen. That tiny smirk stayed on his face. He knew something she didn't, and it was starting to show. Little hints were popping up, like puzzle pieces falling into place. Why was a cop car here already? Why wasn't Jake worried? Karen thought she was the one in charge, calling the police to scare Jake into moving his truck. But the truth was sneaking up behind her, and she had no idea. The neighbors started peeking out their windows, too. They heard Karen's loud voice and saw her pacing on Jake's lawn. What's she up to now? One lady muttered, pulling back her curtain. She's calling the cops over that truck, a man asked his wife, shaking his head. Everyone knew Karen liked to make a fuss, but this was big, even for her. They watched, waiting to see what would happen next. Some thought Jake might finally snap and yell back. Others figured he'd just keep being quiet, like always. Karen finished her call and shoved the phone back in her pocket. You're in trouble now, she said to Jake, pointing at him like she'd just won a game. The police are coming, and they'll make you move that ugly truck. She crossed her arms and stood there, looking proud, like she'd solved all her problems. She thought she'd scare Jake, that he'd finally listen to her. But Jake didn't look scared. He didn't even look annoyed. He just tilted his head a little and said, "Okay, Karen," in that same easy voice. Then he stayed right where he was, leaning on the doorframe, watching her. That's when the police car started moving again. It crept closer, slow and steady, coming up the street toward Jake's house. Karen didn't hear it yet, she was too busy glaring at Jake and planning what she'd say when the cops got there. She thought they were coming for him. She thought she'd called them, and they'd show up to back her up. But the car wasn't here because of her phone call. It was already on its way before she even dialed. And it wasn't coming for Jake, it was coming for her. Jake's smirk got a tiny bit bigger. He shifted his weight, crossing one foot over the other, like he was getting comfy for what was about to happen. Karen didn't notice. She didn't see the car pulling up behind her. She didn't hear the soft hum of its engine or the click of a door opening. She was too wrapped up in her own victory, thinking she'd finally beat Jake at his own game. But the game wasn't what she thought it was. Something big was coming, and it was getting closer every second. The tension was thick now, like the air before a thunderstorm. Karen's loud words and Jake's quiet calm were crashing together, building up to something wild. Little clues were starting to shine through Jake's smirk, the police car, the way he didn't fight back. Karen thought she had everything under control, but she was about to find out she didn't. What was Jake hiding? Why were the cops really here? The answers were almost ready to spill out, and when they did, Karen wouldn't know what hit her. The moment was here, and it was big. The police car that had rolled up so quiet and sneaky was now right there, parked near Jake's house. A cop stepped out, tall and serious, with a radio on his shoulder that made little crackling sounds. He didn't look around or wait. He walked straight toward Karen Miller, his boots tapping on the pavement. Karen didn't hear him at first. She was still on her phone, talking to 911, thinking she'd won. She spun around when she finally noticed him, her face all smug and proud. "Oh good, you're here," she said, her voice loud and happy. She pointed at Jake like he was a bad kid caught stealing cookies. "This man's breaking every rule in the book. His truck's illegal, and he won't listen to me." She held the phone tight, nodding like the cop was her best friend come to help her out. She thought this was it, Jake was in big trouble now, and she'd be the hero who fixed everything. But the cop didn't even look at Jake. Not once. His eyes stayed locked on Karen, steady and calm. He stopped a few steps away from her and held up one hand. "Ma'am," he said, his voice firm but not mean, "put the phone down. We need to talk." Karen froze. The smug look on her face melted away, like ice cream on a hot day. Her eyes got wide, and her mouth opened a little, but no words came out at first. "Me," she finally stammered, her voice shaking. "What for? I didn't do anything. I'm the one who called you." She pointed at herself, then at Jake, then back at herself, like she couldn't believe what was happening. Her face went white, pale as a sheet, and her hand with the phone started to tremble. That's when Jake moved. He'd been standing there the whole time, leaning against his doorframe, watching everything with that tiny smirk on his face. Now, he stepped forward, slow and easy, like he wasn't in a hurry. He reached into his pocket, not the one with his keys or some gum, but the other one. He pulled something out, something small and shiny. He held it up so everyone could see. It was a badge, a real, honest-to-goodness police badge, glinting in the sunlight. "I've been watching you, Karen," Jake said. His voice was steady, not loud or angry, just clear and strong. He looked right at her, his eyes sharp. "All those fake complaints you've been filing? The fines you've been pocketing from the HOA? We've got it all on record." He didn't yell or point fingers. He just stood there, holding that badge, letting his words sink in like rain soaking into the ground. The crowd of neighbors watching from their yards gasped. It was like someone had sucked all the air out of the street. Old Mr. Thompson dropped his rake. Mrs. Lee covered her mouth with her hand. Kids on their bikes stopped pedaling and stared. Karen's jaw dropped so low it looked like it might hit the grass. Her phone slipped from her hand and landed with a soft thud. She didn't even try to pick it up. She just stood there, blinking fast, like her brain couldn't catch up with what she'd just heard. Jake wasn't just some random guy with an old truck. He wasn't just a quiet neighbor who didn't fit in. He was an undercover cop. That's right, a secret police officer, sent to Meadow Hills to watch Karen and figure out what she was up to. All this time, while she'd been yelling and complaining about his truck, he'd been keeping an eye on her. Every fake rule she made up, every fine she told people to pay, every sneaky thing she did, Jake knew about it. He'd been writing it down, collecting proof, waiting for the right moment to show who he really was. Karen's head whipped around, looking from Jake to the cop to the neighbors and back again. "What? No," she sputtered. "That's not true. I didn't do anything wrong. He's lying." She pointed at Jake, her finger shaking like a leaf in the wind. But the cop didn't budge. He stepped closer to her, his face serious. "We've got evidence, ma'am," he said. "Lots of it. People have been talking, and we've been listening." The neighbors started whispering to each other. "She's been taking money," one lady asked. "All those fines, she kept them," a man said, sounding mad. Kids giggled, pointing at Karen like she was the bad guy in a movie. The truth was coming out, fast and loud, and Karen couldn't stop it. She'd thought she was the queen of Meadow Hills, the one who made the rules and told everyone what to do. But now, she was the one in trouble, and Jake was the one who'd caught her. Jake put his badge back in his pocket and crossed his arms. "You thought I was just some guy you could boss around," he said to Karen. "But I've been here for a reason. You've been scamming people, making up rules, charging fake fines, keeping the cash for yourself. We've got letters, receipts, everything. It's over, Karen." His voice stayed calm, but every word hit her like a little punch. Karen's face went from white to red. She looked like she might scream or cry or run away, maybe all three. "This is ridiculous," she yelled, stomping her foot. "I'm not a crook. I'm helping the neighborhood. You can't do this to me." But the cop shook his head. "We can, ma'am," he said. "And we are." He reached for something on his belt, a pair of shiny handcuffs. The crowd got louder now. Some people cheered, clapping their hands. Others just stared, too shocked to say anything. Karen had been bossing them around for months, years, even telling them what to do, making them pay for silly things like leaving a toy in the yard. And all that time, she'd been sneaky, taking money she wasn't supposed to have. Now, Jake had flipped everything upside down. He wasn't the bad guy. She was. Karen's eyes darted around, looking for a way out, but there wasn't one. The cop was right there, and Jake was watching her with that same steady look. Her big plan to get rid of him had backfired big time. She'd called 911 to get Jake in trouble, but the police were already coming for her. Jake had known it all along. That's why he'd stayed so calm, why he'd smirked when she yelled. He wasn't scared of her because he had the truth on his side and a badge to prove it. This was it, the big reveal. Jake wasn't just a neighbor. He was a hero, and Karen? She was the villain who'd finally been caught. The street buzzed with excitement as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Karen's perfect little world was falling apart, and Jake had made it happen. The big moment wasn't over yet. The cop standing in front of Karen didn't wait for her to keep arguing. He pulled out his shiny handcuffs and snapped them right onto her wrists. Click, click. Karen's clipboard, the one she always carried like a prize, slipped from her hands and fell to the ground with a loud clatter. She looked down at it, then up at the cop, her eyes wide and wild. "This is ridiculous," she screeched, her voice high and shrill, like a bird caught in a net. "You can't do this to me." But the cop didn't listen. He held her arm and started walking her toward the squad car parked nearby. Karen kept yelling as they went. "I didn't do anything wrong. This is a mistake," she shouted, twisting her head to glare at Jake. But the truth was out now, and it wasn't pretty. Turns out, Karen had been scamming the whole neighborhood for months. She'd been making up fake rules like saying trash cans couldn't be blue or lawns had to be cut every 3 days. Then she'd charge people money, telling them they owed fines for breaking her silly rules. But instead of giving that money to the HOA to help the neighborhood, she kept it all for herself. She'd been sneaky, stuffing cash into her pockets while everyone thought she was just bossy. Jake, though. He'd been onto her the whole time. While he played the quiet new guy, parking his truck and waving hello, he was secretly gathering proof. He wrote down what she said, saved letters she sent, and even talked to neighbors who'd paid her fake fines. He was like a detective in a story, watching and waiting while Karen dug her own grave with every mean word and greedy trick. Now, all that proof was with the police, and Karen couldn't talk her way out of it. The cop opened the squad car door and helped Karen inside. She was still yelling, but it didn't matter. The door shut with a thud, and the car started up. As it drove off down the street, the neighbors came out of their houses and yards. They clapped and cheered, big smiles on their faces. "Good job, Jake," one man called. "She's finally gone," a lady shouted, waving her hands in the air. Kids jumped up and down, laughing like it was a party. Jake stood by his house, watching the car disappear around the corner. He gave a little wave to the neighbors, then walked over to his beat-up truck. He hopped inside and leaned out the window, a grin on his face. "Guess the parking space is mine after all," he said, his voice light and happy. Then he started the engine and pulled the truck forward just a bit, parking it right where it always was, like a quiet way of saying he'd won. The street felt different that day. It was lighter, like a big, heavy cloud had floated away. People smiled at each other, talking and laughing about how Karen was finally gone. They could breathe again, free from her clipboard and her mean rules. Jake had done it. He'd brought justice to Meadow Hills, and everyone was glad. Okay, let's take a step back and think about what just happened in Meadow Hills. This story with Jake and Karen teaches us something big, something you can carry with you every day. Here's the thing, sometimes the person you think is weak or powerless is actually the one holding all the cards. Karen looked at Jake and saw a quiet guy with an old, beat-up truck. She thought he was just some nobody, someone she could boss around because he didn't talk much or fight back. She judged him by what she saw on the outside: his scratched-up truck, his plain clothes, his small house. To her, he didn't look strong or important. But Karen got it all wrong. Jake wasn't weak. He wasn't just some random guy. He had strength hiding underneath, like a secret superpower she couldn't see. That old truck. It didn't mean he was poor or lazy, it was just a truck. His quiet ways. They didn't mean he was scared, they meant he was smart, waiting for the right time to show who he really was. Jake was an undercover cop, and he had the power to stop Karen's sneaky tricks. All that time she was yelling at him, he was holding the winning hand, and she didn't even know it. That's the cool part of this story. It's like a reminder for all of us. Maybe there's someone in your life, a kid at school, a neighbor, or even a friend who seems small or quiet. You might think they don't matter much, just because they don't show off or make a lot of noise. But what if they're like Jake? What if they've got something awesome inside, waiting to come out? You never know who's about to surprise you. So next time you meet someone new, don't judge them too fast. Give them a chance. They might turn out to be the hero of the story, just like Jake was. Think about it. Karen thought she was the queen of Meadow Hills. She walked around with her clipboard, acting like she owned everything. She looked down on Jake because he didn't fit her idea of perfect. But in the end, she was the one who got caught, and Jake was the one standing tall. That shows us something else: being loud or bossy doesn't make you strong. Real strength is quiet sometimes. It's in the way you stand up for what's right, even if nobody sees it at first. Jake didn't need to yell or brag. He just did his job, and that was enough to change everything. So, what about you? Have you ever had a moment like this? Maybe there was a time when someone thought you couldn't do much, but you proved them wrong. Or maybe you turned the tables on someone like Karen, someone who tried to push you around, but you came out on top. I'd love to hear your stories. Drop them in the comments below, because I'm dying to know what you've been through. Did you surprise someone? Did you show them you're stronger than they thought? Tell me all about it. Here's the big takeaway: don't count anyone out. Not yourself, not your friends, not even the quiet kid sitting in the back of the class. Everyone's got something special inside, and sometimes it's the people you least expect who end up being the strongest. Be like Jake, keep your eyes open, stay kind, and wait for your moment. You never know when you'll get to shine.